Hey folks, Palmer Thombs, DawgsHQ here, team beat writer over at our site, which we've had a great week, and we are starting to cap things off here. Joined today by Jesse Simonton of On3. He's been putting out his position by position breakdown post spring, top 10 for quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. The Georgia Bulldogs are in the top 10 for all four of those categories. The only team that is in the top 10 for all four. Jesse, you mentioned Ole Miss in there. They've got an honorable mention in 3 rankings. There's a couple of teams that have 3 rankings or 2 rankings and an honorable mention. But the Bulldogs are the only team to be ranked in the top 10 of all of them. And you gave me a little bit of a hint that the offensive line is probably going to be in the top 10 there too. What is it that you're so high on about this Georgia offense, and what are your expectations for the group going into 2023?
Well, thanks for having me, Palmer. I mean, I think it's can be distilled pretty simply that this is just an extremely efficient and deep group. You know, they're versatile at a lot of different positions, skill sets, whether it is at tailback. They don't have a bell cow guy like some of the other programs that are in that top 10 list, but they have a deep stable of guys that I think are very capable. The wide receiver room, you know, they got long guys, fast guys, twitchy guys. And then obviously tight end. I mean, Brock Bowers is the Mackey Award winner, unequivocal best tight end in the country in 2023. So it's just a deep group. Todd Monken did a great job with those guys a year ago. Obviously, they're breaking in a new quarterback. We'll see what happens. With Carson Beck, probably the presumed starter there. But I think they have a super high floor as evidenced by these rankings, and then a super high ceiling that makes them one of the best offenses in the country, I think, come the fall.
Yeah, you mentioned Monken and the quarterbacks there. That's exactly where I was going to go, because that's where every conversation with Georgia seems to go this spring. Having seen the spring game, what's your assessment of that quarterback room, where those guys are at, specifically Carson Beck and Brock Vandagriff, but Gunnar Stockton too, an incredibly talented player there as well. But Beck and Brock seem to be the two competing for the starting job. What's your assessment of those two guys, having seen them in the spring game? And it's kind of a two-parter here. Where do you think a Mike Bobo offense may differ from a Todd Monken offense that I know you were really high on last year?
Yeah, I mean, I've written several columns about Georgia's quarterback kind of derby that's going on right now. I think, it's from afar, and your boots on the ground there, so you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but it certainly seems from talking to folks and from afar that Carson kind of rose to the challenge, that, Brock and Gunnar had nice springs. I think Brock was probably better in a couple of the close scrimmages than Carson Beck, and yet when the lights were on, the fans were there in their red and black on G-Day. It was Carson Beck who just looked flawless. And I think, he enters the offseason with a lot of momentum. I think it cannot be shortchanged the fact that Georgia has 3 guys who have basically been in this system, because while they will have a new offensive coordinator, Kirby's made it clear that this is the Georgia system. Terminology, the plan, that's going to remain the same. Bobo will have his fingerprints there. So with Carson Beck having multiple years of experience, that Brock has now, I think, continued to show a little growth. That's huge. I mean, the fact that none of those guys jumped in the portal, Georgia has a lot of depth. If Kirby could open up this thing with the way their schedule goes, he could let Carson and Brock play. Maybe not 50-50, maybe it's 75. Maybe Brock gets the Carson Beck treatment a la last year, but perhaps a few more snaps. And so I like that QB room. As for Bobo, I think it's going to look very similar, but probably a bit more play action, just because that's something that he's been very good at kind of scheming up. Probably a bit more, less maybe 12 personnel. And I think that's probably, two-tone. While I really like Georgia's tight end room, I think they're deeper at receiver this year. And the fact that Darnell is now not there, Oscar's not kind of that 6th offensive lineman that Darnell Washington was. So I think you maybe, take Oscar off the field for X amount of snaps versus a year ago, and you have a guy like Ra Thomas instead.
Yeah, 6'8", 280-pound playmakers don't grow on trees, and Georgia's seeing that this offseason, seeing what they had in Darnell Washington and seeing what they are going to miss not having Darnell Washington. You mentioned the schedule there, and I'll add to the quarterback conversation. UT Martin, Ball State, UAB in the first 4 weeks. You have South Carolina in there week 3, but you get all 4 of those games at home. I completely agree with you there. I think that there's a big opportunity, and I think it's why it was very important that Brock did come back to Georgia. A big opportunity to get both those guys reps. Brock talked about it this spring. He wouldn't have stayed last winter before the spring, and this spring after practice wouldn't have stayed if he didn't feel like he was getting better. So working with Mike Bobo, working with the staff that they have there, they bring back all 4 of the position coaches on the offensive side of the ball, aside from Monken, and they replace Monken from within with Bobo. I do think that there's a big opportunity there early in the year to develop all 3 of those guys, but especially those 2. And I think that those reps that Brock Vandagriff could be getting, like you said, the Carson Beck of last year could be huge for his development. Former 5-star guy, the highest rated guy in that room. Certainly excited to see what all 3 of those guys bring to the table when the live bullets are flying. You mentioned Ra Thomas. You mentioned Georgia's explosive receiver group. You've got them ranked, I think it was number 6 among all groups in the country. What is the difference between this Georgia group compared to years past, where it doesn't necessarily feel like they've gotten the same amount of respect? Maybe they weren't quite as good, or maybe they are just that much better this year, having added a couple of players in the portal and brought back a couple of key contributors. And obviously, it doesn't hurt to have a pass catcher like Brock Bowers in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other reason Georgia probably isn't a little bit higher on these rankings in particular is because, unlike at Texas, LSU, Ohio State, obviously the unequivocal number 1, even Washington has 2 potential All-Americans. Georgia's going to spread the ball around more, and their top target's obviously the tight end in Bowers. But with McConkey, with a guy like Dylan Bell, who I think is going to maybe really emerge this year, then you basically take Missouri's best receiver and Dominique Lovett. You take Ra Thomas, Mississippi State's top guy. The fact that Kirby went out and said, all right, this is where we need some help. Went out and landed 2 impact SEC transfers. And then Arian Smith, how healthy will he be? If he's good to go in week 1, that gives Georgia just a game-breaking, speedster there, a little cheetah guy that you can just we saw what he did, against Ohio State when he basically, broke the guy's ankles on a 9 route. So it's a deep group. I don't think, there's going to be one guy that maybe has 1,000 yards or anything. And so that's why I think some folks maybe shortchange what that room is capable of.
Last question here is again, we really appreciate you joining us here today, Jesse. We kind of alluded to it earlier. The expectations for this group are really high. Do you think that they could be the best in the country? And if that's to be the case, what do you think the biggest deciding factor in that would be?
Well, best, I don't know. I guess that depends on how you would define best. For me, I think they could be the most efficient. I do think they could be the most efficient. I think they'll be up there in terms of explosiveness. They're certainly going to be up there in terms of yards per play. I think in a lot of the advanced metrics, Georgia's going to look quite favorable. The schedule is going to help that, but I just think they're going to run roughshod over a lot of these defenses, even in the SEC. And so they may not lead the nation in scoring or lead, the nation in passing touchdowns or rushing touchdowns like they did a year ago. But they're going to be up there in a whole bunch of categories. And I think, again, you circle that efficiency number. That's where I think Georgia could certainly finish as one of the top 2 or 3 offenses in the country in 23.
Well, folks, you heard it here first. Georgia could have one of the best offenses in the country. Head on over to DawgsHQ. We've got a sign-up special going on right now. $1 gets you full access to our site, everything that we've got to offer, from the message boards to the premium articles, team insight, recruiting intel as well. Head on over to DawgsHQ. $1 gets you access through Halloween, through the Georgia-Florida game, halfway through the 2023 season as the Bulldogs, Kirby Smart and company, look to go for 3 in a row. Jesse, really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Palmer.